Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches. Good morning and welcome to Encounter. My name is Joe Sellepack. I'm the Executive Director at the Broome County Council of Churches and your host today for Encounter. 1 Thessalonians has an interesting verse. It says, pray without ceasing. It's a very 3 words, but in those 3 words there's an awful lot packed into it. And then the next verse, pray without ceasing, and everything give thanks. These are very tough verses for us to hear, especially in January when the weather outside is gray and the snow may be falling, or we might be in what I like to think of as 40 degree grayness, where you have the wind and the everything is outside, but you just don't feel like being out because it's just so depressing. There are lots of reasons for us to pray and lots of reasons for us to be able to enter into prayer. What do you think about prayer in the church? What's the importance of prayer in a person's life?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because at Union Presbyterian Church in Endicott this year, we are really focusing on prayer. Our leadership is focusing on prayer to really make sure that we are rooted and grounded in God's love, and that we are strengthened for the tasks at hand. So I really believe that prayer is an essential part of our ministry, not only for ourselves, but for the people we're trying to serve. So one of the things I've been trying to do is to let people know that there are all kinds of prayer. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation at all, and try to introduce folks to different kinds of prayer as well.
So my guest today is Pat Raube from Union. She's the pastor at Union Presbyterian Church. Welcome to Encounter, Pat.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here today.
So there are lots of different types of prayer.
Yes.
What would some of those types be?
Well, for some of us, we get a lot of strength using a prayer book. The Presbyterians have a Book of Common Worship, which has a beautiful service of daily prayer, very much modeled on the Book of Book of Common Prayer, yeah. The Anglican tradition. And it is grounded in the Psalms, it's grounded in Scripture, and it gives us different prayer requests to make each day of the week. And for some of us, that's a wonderful practice. For others, that's a little too formal, that's a little too prescribed. We want our prayer to be a little more open and a little more spontaneous. So recently in a sermon, I talked about the prayer practice of the Examen, which goes back to the Catholic Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Yeah. And it's a daily practice that is designed to help us, in a sense, to check in with ourselves. Most people do it at night. And Ignatius used the language of consolations and desolations.
Yeah.
Where today did you find consolations, and where today did you find desolations? Now, I think language that I suggest for folks is to say, in what happened today, did you find yourself the most grateful? And in what happened today, when did you find yourself the least grateful? What was the moment in your day that was the hardest? That was the least comfortable, that made you the least happy and grateful. So at the end of the day, we can do that, but we don't do that in a vacuum. We do that again. We begin knowing that we are surrounded by the love of God. We end knowing that we're surrounded by the love of God, and we hand it to God.
So even the disruption or the thing that makes you feel uncomfortable is not beyond the scope of God's presence or God's ability to love.
Absolutely. God is with us in all of it. in the good and the bad. It just helps us to remind ourselves of that.
So when a disruption happens, like, we're, something causes you to feel dislocated, or you feel as if your world is changing. It might not even be that dramatic. It might be just this person makes you feel uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
In what way does prayer help you feel grounded in that?
One of the things I notice is that it's human nature to turn to prayer in the harder times.
Right.
And it's human nature to maybe forget about prayer somewhat when things are going well. I just think that's who we are. We tend to take the good times for granted.
Mm-hmm.
But when we are at sea, when we are anxious, when we're worried, when everything feels like it's falling apart, and we return to prayer, we find that God has been waiting for us.
Right.
God has been there all along waiting for us. And for myself, one of the things that has been the most important in my prayer practice has been the Psalms.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a Presbyterian, and we have John Calvin as our great-great-grandpa. And John Calvin said in his commentary on the Psalms are an anatomy of all parts of the human soul.
Yeah.
So there is nothing that I can feel, there is nothing I can experience that is not able to be found somewhere in there, from the greatest joy to the greatest despair. So I find myself at Psalm 147, the Lord heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds.
Mm-hmm.
And that is one of the most profound experiences for me that I've ever had, of finding myself at a hard time, being reminded that I am truly still rooted in God's love, despite all of it.
I know it's one of the Psalms that I always cringe at is that one, by the rivers of Babylon, there I sit,
Yes.
when I remember Zion. And then the beginning part of it's okay.
Oh, it's beautiful.
And it's part of what we always are drawn to, but then
Yes.
at the end it says, blessed are they who take their little ones and dash their heads against the rock. You're sitting there cringing and you're wondering, what is that about?
What is that about?
Yeah.
So for those who are familiar with her work, the writer Kathleen Norris spent a lot of time in monasteries praying daily with monks and nuns. And monks and nuns tend to go through the Psalms over and over and over again. And she noticed that some of these monasteries left out those Psalms or left out those verses. And she found in her experience that these Psalms, when they were prayed in their fullness, including the ugly parts, she felt that that was a sign of greater emotional and spiritual health in the monasteries, because people, look, you and I may be horrified at the idea of people taking revenge on other people, and I am, and I don't think it's right, and no one should do it. But the Psalm reminds us of human nature. The Psalm reminds us of what people are capable of, and it gives voice to anger and despair,
Right.
even to an extent that is profoundly uncomfortable.
Yeah, one of my theological mentors was Howard Thurman. I read a lot of Howard Thurman, and one of the things that he used to do before he preached was he would take Psalm 139 and he would quote it. God, you have searched me, you know me, and all that kind of stuff. But then you get down to the end where it turns to this really anxious thought. He left that out, and I always wondered why. Why he would leave that out, and he and nowhere in the literature about that does he talk about why he leaves it out. But I always thought that was kind of short-sighted, because of the fact that sometimes I do feel anxious.
Right.
I do feel like the world is ordered against me. That
Yes.
somehow I am on the spot.
Yeah.
And David, whoever wrote that psalm, may have felt that way. Especially a king would feel that way, I can imagine. But more so, even for anyone who has any type of responsibility, we know what it feels like to be isolated and alone, and not feel connected. So, yeah, I always, like Kathleen Norris, I've always felt that we need to have these moments where we give rise to the anxious thoughts, the darkness that lurks within human capability, that revenge, taking a little one, dashing them against the rock, is not something I like to think about, but I have to go there because sometimes I do.
Well, and naming it, I think, is the first step towards being able to let it go.
Right.
I think it's when we don't name our darker impulses, our more angry selves, when we don't acknowledge them, that they have a chance to get rooted in us and take us over. If we can name it, I think it is part of being more spiritually mature, more spiritually healthy and attuned.
So my guest today is Pat Raube from Union Presbyterian Church. And your church practices a certain type of prayer.
Yes.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the ways to pray is to pray with your body. And this takes all sorts of forms. When I was at Boston College, there was a liturgical dance group that it wasn't a performance. They prayed with their bodies, and they invited us into the simple movements of being able to pray with our bodies. And in our congregation, we have from time to time done simple bodily prayers during worship. Another way to pray with the body is to use the labyrinth.
Right.
And a number of years ago, I personally purchased a labyrinth that I would be able to share with our congregation. And for those who aren't familiar with the labyrinth, it's important to say what it's not. It's not a maze.
Right.
So people worry that a labyrinth is going to be something they're going to walk into or walk on and get stuck or find dead ends, or kind of it's going to be a test.
It's like the corn maze where the boogeyman's going to jump out and grab you.
Corn maze. It's not the corn maze. Having done that with my youth group in October, I can tell you, it's not the corn maze. A labyrinth, the one we have at Union Presbyterian Church, is an 8-circuit labyrinth. It's modeled on the same style as the one at Chartres Cathedral in France, which is more than 800 years old at this time. And the labyrinth has one path. You walk into it and you walk out of it on the same path, but the path takes you in unexpected twists and turns. It takes you towards your goal in a way that is not expected, in a way that sometimes can feel uncertain, but you keep walking, and you know and you trust that ultimately you're going to get to the center. So in my mind, the labyrinth is a profound, first of all, metaphor for the Christian journey. We begin, our source is God and our goal is God. So when we begin the labyrinth, we know that we're going from God wherever we go in our life's journey. And we know that at the center of the labyrinth, just as at the center of our lives, at the culmination of our lives, God is there as well. And we encourage people to pray the labyrinth at different times. Now, for me, typically we've brought it out during Holy Week. We've brought it out on Good Friday. This year we have a plan to bring it out a little more frequently than that throughout Lent.
Okay.
I'm hoping to make it available to the congregation on Sundays as well for maybe 1 month of the Lenten season. And the labyrinth is something that once you've done it, it really kind of starts to root in you. It starts to become something that you want to do again. I personally discovered the labyrinth when I was first ordained and went on a conference for newly ordained ministers down at Stony Point. And they have an outdoor labyrinth made with rocks.
Right.
And I walked the labyrinth and had a profound experience of the presence of God and knew that it was something I wanted to do again and again and again.
So when a person enters into the labyrinth, is there like a map, or what do they use when they go into a labyrinth? How do they pray? Or is there some type of explanation that comes along with it?
Sure. When we have people walk the labyrinth, we have a few pages of suggestions of how they might walk it. So one possibility, and one that I've done quite a bit, is to walk the labyrinth with your hands down, palm down. And the symbolism of that is that you are letting go.
Letting go.
As you walk into the labyrinth, you are letting go. And you are praying to let go of everything that keeps you from communion with God, with everything that gets in the way of your awareness of the presence of God. Then when you get to the center of the labyrinth, you turn your hands over and hold them in a cup to show that you are ready to receive whatever it is God has to give you. So this is one way, just one way of walking the labyrinth. And then you can stay in the center as long as you like. And then when you're ready to go, you can walk out of the labyrinth again.
Right.
That's one possibility. Another possibility is to walk the labyrinth with an intentional prayer for discernment.
Right.
So many times someone will go into the labyrinth thinking, I need to make this decision, or I need some help in knowing how to even think about this situation with my family or my job. And so they stand at the opening of the labyrinth and they say a prayer of openness to God's guidance. And then they walk the labyrinth very intentionally, seeking to be open to that. And when they get to the middle of the labyrinth, they may want to pray again. They may want to sit down. There's a little circle in the middle of the labyrinth, and there's room for a few people to sit down in there. They may want to offer a prayer of thanksgiving for whatever they have learned, or they may want to continue the prayer they began with. And then they walk out again, and we encourage people again to pray at the beginning and at the end. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. People do it in all different ways. Some people do it very slowly. I've seen people walk the labyrinth, and there are, the way the labyrinth is designed, there are lovely little